Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you to the Jordan Center for hosting us. This is a sort of co-production of the Journalism Institute at NYU. I'm Azadeh Moaveni. I run the program in global journalism. And so pleased to be doing this together with the Jordan Center. And I'm just going to very informally introduce our panel. We have Professor Jessica Pisano, who is professor of politics at the New School for Social Research and the author of really fascinating work on Ukraine and on Russia that you can look more into. And then we are gathered to discuss and talk to Terrell Germaine Starr, who is an independent journalist and foreign correspondent, as we also say, and we'll talk about maybe some of those words later. Terrell is the founder and host of the Black Diplomats podcast. He is one of the, I would say, leading voices covering Ukraine and having covered the war in Ukraine, although his expertise on Eastern Europe and Russia and Ukraine extends far further back. But to my mind, he was someone that I wanted to bring to NYU from very early on in this conflict, because I think that his reporting, his style of reporting, his positionality is really singular and is really at the forefront of a lot of the questions and challenges that we face reporting on conflicts, especially conflicts that have very complicated geostrategic sort of backstories, but also bring terrible human suffering to those at the center of it. So really delighted to have both of you, really honored. We're on Zoom as well. Those of you who are on Zoom, we will be able to take your questions in the chat when we come to that. We're going to keep this quite informal. Terrell, if you could just maybe spend a few minutes by way of background, talking about how you came to this line of reporting, your own academic backgrounds, podcast, and what it aims to do, and then we'll go into some questions. All
right, good. Well, thank you all for coming out to listen to me talk. I really appreciate it. I always say anytime someone takes time out of their day to listen to someone speak for an hour, it's a sign of respect, because it means that you don't think it's boring, or at least you hope I'm not. So I think it just takes a lot. So I'm always grateful anytime someone says, I want to hear what this person has to say. So, a lot of people really came to know me and my work when the invasion of Ukraine broke last year in February, February 24th. And I was an independent journalist. I wasn't connected with anyone, had essentially no resources. All the coverage that you saw from me came from this phone, all of it. All of it, every last bit came from this iPhone. And I think that will segue into a lot about how I've empowered myself and thus other people to learn about this conflict, because ultimately it deals with how I view the world and what I think journalism is and how we should be talking about it. And I look at journalism very much like I do urban planning. Americans in particular, we're not taught what our participation ought to be in foreign affairs. And what do I mean by that? So this war breaks in Ukraine. The bottom line is, why should I care about it, right? America make their arguments, the world's not a superpower. We have these waters that protect us. It's not our conflict. Why should you care? A lot of people, quite honestly, were very interested in this Black guy with the deep voice who was going around Ukraine, helping these, quote unquote, white people lead the war, and why does he care, right? And so when I think about this, I think as someone like me who was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, or you grew up anywhere, when I bring up the urban planning example and how that informed my journalism in Ukraine, I being a Black person in America, and you understand how you always ask yourself, why, in my case, why did I grow up Black and poor in Detroit? And then once you go to school, get your undergrad, you learn a lot about urban planning. And urban planning is essentially how is a city planned, how is a county plan, how is a state plan, right? These schools go here, this park goes there, this business goes here, this avenue is in this location. The world is carved out essentially the same way, right? And so every country, this whole concept of nation state is pretty new, in our century. And so there are kingdoms, et cetera, before that. And so with me, when I think about my coverage in Ukraine, how I got into it was roughly 20 some years ago. I'm 43 years old. And I was invited to, when I was an undergrad, summer before my senior year, invited to spend a summer in before I get into that, I applied for an international volunteer program that, if I was accepted, would pay for my 3-month experience in any number of countries. On this application, I chose all the Black countries. And then once I got my acceptance letter to this particular program, it invited me to Russia, where I did not want to go. And I very boldly called the administrator and said, "You made a mistake. Why are you sending me to this country with these white people? I do not want to go." And so he didn't change his mind, said, "You're gonna have to accept this opportunity or not go." Called my godmother, asking her, seeking her comfort. And instead I got admonishment and was almost shamed into it. Your mama Black, your daddy Black. So she went down my whole family tree to talk about my Black existence, right? And so it taught me a very valuable lesson. One, it taught me that as a human being. She also came from a position of faith. She said, Terrell, God does not like, her whole position, God does not like us to, you can't look at it like this. This is God's world and God's plan. You need to open up your mind. And so the people who really connected me to Ukraine and ultimately to Ukraine and to this part of the world were Black people who would never go there. But these were Black people who said that you must open up your mind. And that's what my coverage, that's my inspiration for my coverage, is to open people's minds. And during the time during my coverage, I realized that a lot of us got a lot of things wrong. Oh, this is the guy I called when I said that, hey, I'm not supposed to go to Russia. It's him. And he said, you got to go. It's him. It's him. Hey, how are you? This is girlfriend. How you doing? Yeah, it was that guy.
There was a civil war in Liberia, so.
Okay, well, that too, yeah. But anyway, yeah, that too. Right. So, but basically, that was my whole point. So I think it's very important that we talk about our own personal narratives in this, and because the way that we cover these things are very much informed by our own lives, and we have to admit that, right? And our own biases and our own fears. And covering Ukraine is really about, as somebody who has expertise and somebody who spent years in this part of the world, who has that, the language background, how do I break this down in a way to help people understand there's a human dynamic to it? And so when I first was covering the war, I was embedded with some Ukrainian territorial defense people. And I was with them for roughly a week. Long story short, Russians bombed our location, almost got killed. Unfortunately, 4 people who were in our unit, the unit I was covering, died during that strike. But from that point, that unit was disbanded. A good friend of mine, Andre, who was a soldier, left that position, went on to help people leave the war. And that's when people started paying attention, right? And they were saying, Terrell, people, a lot of my Black friends are making jokes out, somehow created the Underground Railroad in Ukraine. But the reporting that I did, a lot of people would say is more activist led, which I don't agree with. I just think that I was telling the truth, which was Russia was launching a genocide against Ukrainian people. And a lot of people from a very basic level were wondering, I thought all these white people liked each other. Now that sounds very basic to us, right? But when you step outside of these ivory towers, that's what people think. And it was just, and people were, and the reason why I talk about my Black experience growing up, people were really fascinated by me. I was born and raised in the largest Black city in the United States, breaking down the politics of these quote unquote white people, right? And the reality of it, what I really wanted to do and to open up the experience is that, on a regional level, Ukrainians are oppressed by Russian colonialism. That's just a fact. Outside of that context, there's a larger conversation about whiteness, right? That leads into how African students were treated once they left, right? And I think that what my coverage did was I brought in my own personal experience of understanding borders and understanding segregation and just taking it at that level that everyone can understand and then expanding it to a global context. And that was the way that people grew to understand me. And as I was traveling from one part of the country to the next, Americans, literally with this phone that I'm holding right now, like this, and communicating with people, they really got a really intimate feel of the people in ways that a more straightforward line of journalism did not accomplish. And for that, I think a lot of people followed me and really were invested in me because I cared, therefore that made them care. And that's the whole point of my journalism. I want everybody to care. I want us to all care about each other. And I think journalism is a very valuable tool to which we can do that. I did it from the local level, covering the Black Lives Matter movement, covering politics, several presidential elections here. And now I'm doing it based in Ukraine right now. And the plug is you can go to my YouTube channel, Black Diplomats Official, where you can really see my weekly reports from there. But I hope that's a good foundation we can build from. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just start because you talked about your own personal background and how as journalists, sort of who we are shapes our view. And I think that's something that really comes out really vividly in your work. I think there is a kind of idea in journalism that there's the view from nowhere, and that there's a sort of objectivity that sort of transcends any particular journalist's kind of personal biography. So this question of diversity, I mean, just in a very basic way, why do you think it's important for people of color, people of different religious backgrounds, people of different gender identities to be in positions of power in newsrooms, to be included widely in conversations, in newsrooms, high-level editorial conversation? I mean, what do we gain in journalism by having a real diversity of those who are reporting, that sort of range of viewpoints that they bring? Because I think, as you say, I mean, maybe some journalism is viewed as activism, but it's actually a pluralism of accountability positions, actually.
Absolutely. I think the best example of this, of the tragedy that happened in 2014 in Ferguson with Mike Brown, the killing, I think he was personally murdered. That's my personal position on that. But the killing of Mike Brown, one of the best things that happened for journalism out of that was that people were empowered again by their cell phones to give their own perspectives. And I think that it made newsrooms pick up their game because they saw because there are eyes on them. And what the digital platforms empower us as citizens to do is to be the public editor for mainstream media in ways that they have not been used to, but I think has been very necessary. A lot of people don't know that journalism is one of those professions through which you don't need a license. It's not like being a doctor or a lawyer or anything like that. And you also have to remember, even here at NYU, or any research in any institution, if you want to do any research, it's one of the only, maybe the only department that doesn't have to go through a particular review through the graduate, I forgot the name of that review board that reviews research before your department approves it. I don't know the name. IRB. Yeah, journalism doesn't have to go through that because our ability to report is enshrined in the US Constitution, right? And so what defines a journalist traditionally has been where you work. Ferguson just put that, just really flipped that on his head. And I think that's a very good thing, right? And in the sense that we have eyes on us. And for me, that goes back to the diversity of views. And so in 2016, you saw more Black people getting more positions of power and authority and influence in presidential elections. You saw it in 2020, but you also saw it in 2018 elections, right? Because it was a reaction to this activist movement that was saying that our voices have been unheard. And I think that a lot of the diversity that we see in media now, in my view, we have to thank the Black activists from Ferguson for leading that, right? Now, and and as it pertains to foreign affairs, and I think this is a segue because I think everything is domestic seeps into the international. So from a foreign affairs perspective, we tend to say in the minority when we refer to people of color, but minorities are the dominant groups of people. Non-white peoples are not the majority in this world. That's the reality, okay? And quite frankly, I think a lot of white people, white American journalists get Ukraine wrong, ironically, right? Because ultimately, so much because I think much of the coverage centered Russia. Much of the coverage, and I'm somebody, this is the Jordan Center. I have a master's degree in Russian, East European, Eurasian studies. So I'm a graduate of one of these degrees. I think that a lot of these degree programs do a great job, but I think generally speaking, there was a hyper focus on Russia, which makes sense ultimately because it's a country, makes sense in the sense that so much of how we cover, media covers things is based on power. Right. And I think that with the coverage coming out, the Ukraine was marginalized in the coverage in the sense that they were not viewed as individual people. And how that rang true to me as a Black journalist is that I know how that feels. Mm-hmm. Right. And so I decided that I would cover Ukraine the way that I would cover my own people. And I think that any journalist should cover any community with that same respect. And so that the respect with which I cover Ukraine comes from our Black journalism tradition, which means that you have to center the people who are suffering under the abuse and under the tyranny. So that's where I came from with it. And because of my regional expertise and my regional knowledge, which is quite frankly lacking beyond the context of Russia and this conflict as well, and not conflict, this invasion, not conflict, but I think that the diversity also needs to include people from Central Asia, people from the indigenous communities that are from the southern parts of Russia as well, right? So I think that because we view the world differently, we understand it better. I think that the coverage will be more fruitful and in ways that will better inform our public.
Perfect. I have too many questions for you. I really appreciate your podcast, among other things. So I'll try to keep us on. Maybe to start off with a question that links to what you've been talking about with respect to care. One of the dilemmas that scholars, right, we're sort of thinking about journalism and and academic work. We face a lot of the same dilemmas, right? One of the debates and discussions that's been happening among people who study the region as political scientists, as sociologists and so forth, is that right now there's no daylight between the positions that people have come to take as scholars because of their expertise in the region, and virtually no diversity of views because everybody this is a very, kind of obvious situation, right? There's
obvious,
lots of
defining obvious.
Well, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is not centered around a set of contested lands, right, in which different parties might have legitimate claims in the same way, right, as we might see elsewhere in the world. This is I mean, if anything, right, we can point to areas of southwestern Russia that, where Ukrainian people and Ukrainian speakers live, right? If anything, we could maybe have an argument about some of the southern parts of Russia about whether they should properly belong to Ukraine. But as far as the sort of the other way around, we're talking about places that, yes, Russian speakers live because Moscow settled them there after killing all Ukrainian speakers in the 20th century.
You're talking about,
right?
Donetsk and Luhansk, that part, yeah.
Yeah, so, but I guess my point here is that, or my question to you is how you think about this kind of problem, right, in which whether for journalists and maybe less so for journalists, but for scholars, we're kind of we kind of all see this thing in the same way, no matter where you come from. And that lack of pluralism, I don't know, is that a problem? Maybe it's not a.
I mean, what's the same way? I just want to answer the question precisely as I can.
Well, so people think differently in different ways about questions of objectivity versus reflexivity, positionality, right? These are different kinds of ways of thinking about knowledge, right? Is there some outside point, right, that is that sees everything, or do we all have different perspectives? In this particular invasion and war, right? There's very broad consensus about what's going on here, right? And for scholars, like there have been conversations recently in which, first of all, some of our Russian colleagues are accusing people of being a little bit Soviet because we're all kind of on the same page. And there's this discomfort, the fact that scholars are taking the same position as the US government.
Okay,
right?
I get what
You
you're
see
saying.
what I'm saying? So I guess my question is,
I get it.
how are you sitting with that in the context of this particular war, right? And your own
I get it.
personal responsibilities and morality and thinking about this in terms of care versus objectivity. How do you think about it?
That's right. Okay, so here's the thing with Ukraine, right? Just to be perfectly clear, I think that it's not a matter of whether I think it's perfectly clear that Russia does not have a legitimate claim for what it's done at all, right? And that's the first thing. I mean, Russia brings up NATO, a whole bunch of other things, which is all bullshit. So they have absolutely no legitimate claim for what they're doing. And you talk about how do you cover that as a journalist, right? In objectivity. I don't believe that there's both sides saying things. I think that there are many cases where one side is right and the other side is just wrong. And I think it's okay to say that there's no point in balancing a lie, and Putin is a master liar. He lied about everything. Okay, so it's kind of like, me and this question going back, I think everything is local. When I cover news here in the States, politicians pound sand up your ass all the time. They lie. Police officers, they lie. Okay. And it's okay not to balance that, right? And I think that the way that we show our intellectual depth in these conversations is simply telling people the truth, because people outside of our spaces may not have spent all the years studying this the way that we do, but they smell bullshit. I'll tell you something else. I went to the National Association for Black Journalists last year to our conference. And I think that everywhere I could not step 10 feet when people say, well, thank you very much for informing us. Thank you very much for showing us what was going on, right? A lot of these people do not have the level of expertise that I have, but they're like, okay, we smell BS, right? And it's okay to say that. And I think that this wrestling with, positions is more of an intellectual exercise that's very unhelpful for the realistic problems that we're dealing with, right? I think this whole thing, I know we're in the Jordan Center. I have a Reeds degree, but I also have a journalism degree. So I know there's certain problematize, right? People like to problematize things, and we don't need to. I think that Putin has done enough with that creating problems already without us having to add to it. So I think it's really that simple. And I think that people who have a problem with it are grappling with things that they need to see a psychologist for. Let me explain what that means. Let me explain what that means, right? So when I report, like the ways in which, if you have any faculty with Russian, I'm not a native speaker by any means, but I'll tell you something that really hit home to me. So I'm sitting at the beginning of the war, all of my close friends, we decide that, hey, we're going to stay in one apartment together. And Andre, I don't know if he's listening on the Zoom, but we're at his place, and because he has a large place, he had sent his family to the States. And so basically, he said, if we need to leave, we'll all be together, right? But the most heartbreaking thing that I heard was listening to Putin's speeches where he talks for 10 to 15 minutes, because the CNN, all the outlets, they may take 30 seconds, cut it, and then they may put and they'll translate it. But in Ukraine, we're listening on the radio and it's, I'm listening to him on the radio and on TV, you get to hear the whole 13 minutes, however he talks. He talks about Ukrainians like they're trash. Like it felt very visceral to me, and and I'm not even Ukrainian, and it bothered me, right? And if you listen to the propagandists, which are nothing more than spokespeople for the Kremlin, the way they're very they're really like bad words that you use to describe Ukrainians, which I'm not going to repeat, regularly used by Kremlin officials. If you subscribe to Dmitry Medvedev's Telegram, he uses very genocidal language. He talks about extermination. It's very clear. If you listen to these people speaking Russian, they're mad. And so for me, it's very clear. So if you're trying to wrestle with this, there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no simple way of saying it. So yeah.
Well, I think that sort of leads us quite well to something else I wanted to ask you about. Because I've really observed and watched you grapple with, being a very prominent correspondent who has a very empathy-driven and accountability-driven sort of ethos to reporting, like focusing on those who are suffering, who are not in power, who are at the receiving end of the very brutal military. Like that is a kind of thematic of your work, right? And then watching you kind of pivot when the war or the conflict erupted in Palestine and in Gaza. So I want to sort of ask you to talk a little bit about that, the challenges of being so prominent in a way on these two conflicts where the geopolitics is complicated to an extent. I mean, who is the victim is really clear. I think as we're hearing in the Ukraine conflict, who is the victim is hotly contested. Clearly people are suffering. So I want to ask you just about your experience of that, being caught in the middle of that, expectations of you to be on the side on that.
Yeah.
And then also just to sort of tuck it in there, I want to ask you about scrutiny, like the scrutiny that journalists of color and foreign correspondents who are of a particular background face. When they're operating independently in a media ecosystem that is very much weighted towards journalists who are pretty comfortable centering state sources, military sources, the positions of states. So also, I guess, sort of covering these two conflicts, these two wars, and then also scrutiny, and like scrutiny when it's directed at journalists of color and journalists of particular backgrounds.
Yeah, so here's the thing. I covered cops for a while when I was being here in the States. I just have a healthy distrust of authority in general, right? Let's just be clear about that, because these people, cops lie, the IDF lies. All these people lie. I just want to keep saying that. And if you're not skeptical of authority, you shouldn't be a journalist, period. Your first question about Gaza. I've been to Palestine. Actually, I planned on going to the West Bank to stay for a month this year. And prior to October 7th, plans didn't work out, but I plan on going next year. What's happening is apartheid. I mean, the thing about my work is that I'm morally consistent. And I don't think that I would do Ukraine any good by being morally inconsistent about other conflicts, right? I think what Ukraine is going through is a genocide. I don't think a number of scholars have acknowledged that. I think that's perfectly clear. Israel is operating an apartheid state in the West Bank and Gaza. I think, there are a dozen human rights organizations that confirm that. And so now here's the thing. How do you cover this as a journalist responsibly and just, number one, telling the truth, but more importantly, I think that we have to, for a long time, there are a certain group of people, and I know this word is controversial, lobby, but I just want us to not be afraid of it anymore, because we just need to say things as fact. I think that there is a way in which we can distinguish the real anti-Semitism that's going on in America, which, by the way, is carried out by white nationalists. FBI reports statistics. It is definitely on an uptick. It has been on the uptick since 2016 when Donald Trump was elected. That's not my opinion. That's not me being partisan. Those are verifiable facts, right? And so that's the thing. And second, but I think that there's a difference when we look at a state and their policies, right? The state of Israel, for a lot of people, they've equated that with Jewish identity. That has been the fundamental problem in the way that we cover it. And so if you criticize the state of Israel, there's this presumption that you're criticizing and you all Jews, and that you're saying that you don't want them to have a state, which is bullshit. And I think for years, people have been fearful of challenging that narrative because they don't want to be considered anti-Semitic, right? And so I think what's happening right now is that you see a growing number of people who are growing hip to that, and they're pushing back. And so, and I think that we have to be really honest about that. And so for me, when I went to the West Bank and I saw the way that streets were partitioned for Arabs versus Jewish people, you're not going to tell me that I didn't see this. You just aren't, okay? No more than you're not going to tell me I didn't see fighter jets coming and killing Ukrainians. You're not going to tell me what I didn't see, right? And so I think the reason now what's happening is that our state policy, we really have to, and I don't want to get too much into it because we don't have enough time. I mean, there are literally classes that deal with Israel as a state. I'm just turning this up. Sorry about that. With the state of Israel, is that what's really unfortunate about this is that, you know, when I posted a photo from Hebron when I was and that's in the West Bank. And basically, this is the part that really made me break down, right? We were walking through Hebron with somebody that was a former IDF soldier, he was just showing us around. And, there are streets in Israel where, I don't know what the Hebrew word for it, but basically it means pure and impure, right? Like if it's a pure street, that means that an Arab cannot walk down those streets. But we were on the streets leading up to that street and that checkpoint. A Palestinian was trying to sell me something. And regardless of where you go, people look at you as a tourist, they say, hey, they try to sell you things. This particular moment really bothered me because I'm getting ready to cross onto streets where his family once lived and he can't go. Where essentially a group of people who are settlers, and I'm not saying this is all matter of fact and this public record is all true. In these settlers, who by the way, many of them are coming from Brooklyn and other parts of New York, went to this man, go to this man's house, tell him to get the fuck out. This is our property now. It's really that simple. And this man was begging me to buy something from him. And just as a Black person with the history that my people have of Jim Crow and not being able to go to certain places, that experience broke me. I think I'm a really tough person, but even right now it haunts me. And so I don't have to wrestle with anything. I saw what I saw. And because, now here's the most important thing, I'm independent, and so no one can fire me. People could choose not to work with me, but, and I think this is something for really journalists, if you're a journalist in the room, that's important to know, but anybody in general. It was difficult for me to work in a newsroom with my values because I couldn't wake up, I couldn't live with myself knowing that I could not report the full truth of things that I saw and what I believe. That's a whole nother conversation. But the second question, it goes back to, can you repeat the second part?
Scrutiny.
The scrutiny, yeah, so the scrutiny, so the scrutiny, when I was accused of being anti-Semitic, that didn't bother me because, number one, I'm one of those people, I just didn't care. That's one thing. And then two, I always, you have to be okay with yourself to know that you're doing the right thing, right? And when I wake up in the morning and I look in the mirror, can I see myself? Can I look at myself honestly, right? Because with the question with Gaza in Israel and Palestine, the question is, am I defending the oppressed? Because if I'm about the oppressed, that means that I can be just as outspoken about anti-Semitism as I am about the oppression of Palestinians, as I am about Ukrainians. Am I representing and giving honor to the people? Or am I trying to be comfortable with the state and power? In my tradition of being a Black, of covering Black activists and being in Black media, for example, my training taught me to always be with the people. And I just took my domestic experience of being with the people and taking it global. And the people who are with the state, they have power. And a lot of people are afraid of contending with that power because it threatens their jobs. And being an independent journalist is really rough. No consistent income. I'm applying for grant money to try to live and do the things I need to do. But my voice has never been stronger. And so the scrutiny is easy to deal with. It's just it's really about, depending on folks like you all, the people who are listening, who believe in my work to support what I do, and also just journalists in general who speak truth to power, just DMing them and letting them know that you care about them and let them know that you are doing the right thing, right? One of the best things that I like about my experiences of this war is a lot of my biggest supporters in Ukraine have been Ukrainian socialists. And people DMing me and saying, well, Terrell, we really like the ways in which you're actually enlightening a lot of people in Ukraine about this, right? Because the genesis of my work is about liberation for all people. I believe that Ukrainians need to be liberated from the tyranny and the oppression that Russia wants to put them under. I don't think our world is safer with anybody under oppression. And I think that my work is very ambassadorial in that it's a call for everybody to understand what liberation looks like for anybody. And that means challenging power and authority, even if that power and authority benefits you in some way or the other.
Quite a beautiful answer.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
so
then we'll go to you guys.
great. Maybe a question, a small question related to that one, and then a bigger question. Small question, I guess, asks you to just continue and to address the issue that you're addressing. You sort of laid out for us how you see the world and how you see your responsibilities to it and how you see authority, state authority, divisions between state and people. We were having a conversation a couple of days ago about imperialism and anti-imperialism and sort of taking morally consistent positions with respect to imperialism. One of the contradictions and challenges in the current situation with respect to Ukraine, of course, is that part of what is happening, right, in the Kremlin's politics and Kremlin aligned powers are attempts to try to provoke monstrous behavior, right, on the part of Western democracies in order to be able to say, see, look, they're just like us, what we're doing in Ukraine isn't really so bad, right? And so I guess my question is how, and you've answered it to a large extent already, but just to push a little bit further, taking these morally consistent positions where you call out abuse wherever it happens, right? In a context in which there are active, deliberate efforts to try to suggest an equivalency between how states and law enforcement and armies behave in democratic countries and how, for example, Russia is behaving in Ukraine. So how do you sort of take these morally consistent positions without veering into the kind of whataboutism?
Because they're all bad. Okay, I don't think it's difficult at all. They're all bad. right? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but they're all bad. So let's talk about disinformation. The way that I look at disinformation is really simple. And I know there are a lot of people who are really dealing with this subject, and I don't think a lot of us do it particularly well, like really break it down. That's a good question. I think it's an important one. I think the best way to counter disinformation is relationships. The reason why people don't trust a lot of information is because they don't trust the people who are delivering it. They don't trust, and I think this is a very bipartisan dynamic, right? They just don't trust the people who are providing the information. I think a lot of it is that a lot of the people who are providing the disinformation, who are giving us information, even if it's legitimate, they don't have a relationship with the people that they're communicating with, right? And so it makes sense why social media is so pervasive in our society, because one of the best things that social media platforms empower us to do is build relationships, whether they're good or bad. Okay, so really break this down, guys. I'm going to give you the journalism school part, then I'm going to get into the area studies part. So the journalism dynamic of it is that prior to Facebook, I remember Facebook came out, 2004, 2005, right? The best way that you could really challenge a newsroom is writing a letter to the editor. Now you can directly tweet a journalist or at a company's handle, right? And I think that the ways in which we are able to fact check information is out of the control of major networks and television stations. And these social media platforms have become ones in which there's no national standard of how to monitor them. And this is going back to your question about state authority. Russia in particular, and this is something I know, Russia in particular, a lot of people don't know, be it the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, or its current iteration, the Russian Federation, their security services are either just as old or perhaps older than ours, right? So Russia has been in the intelligence game for quite a long time, for one. And two, Russia has also tried to infiltrate the civil rights movement, 1950s and 1960s. So this is not particularly new. Now, here's a real question, is how impactful, or and we think about the continent of Africa, right? The reason why Russia for a long time, they did the best. I think they were really good in that they were engaging Africa through education. Tens of thousands of people of Africans went to the former Soviet Union to study. What they were very good with, and Chinese are good with as well, is building relationships, regardless of how sincere you think they are, right? And that's a whole nother question. America, I don't think is in the relationship business for good purposes. I think that's a fundamental issue. But the hypocrisy comes, I see a lot of people, I consider myself to be left-leaning. I see a lot of people on the left who have a very healthy critique of what's going on in Gaza, but at the same time, have this very NATO approach towards what's going on in Ukraine, which is very ill-informed and morally inconsistent. Because what you're doing now, this is going to the area studies part, right? I'm going to use an area studies term called hegemony. I'm sorry, my teeth. I got these Invisaligns, y'all. Hegemony, yes. And so basically what that word means is that it's really about your political, economic, and military influence over another group of people. That's breaking down, that's what it is. And so the people who really assert the fact that NATO provoked Russia are basically saying that Western hegemony, right, is largely responsible for Russia's reaction, right? We have to protect ourselves. We are the victims. And so that ignores the fact that Russia historically has its own hegemony, right? And what does that? It doesn't look like Iraq. It doesn't look like Afghanistan. It doesn't look like South America. You know what it looks like? It looks like Siberia, where all the people, that Siberia is not indigenous Russian land. It is land that was colonized starting from the 14th century onward. The south of Russia, not indigenous territory. at the start of the war, one of the things that you saw were at these hospitals, the people who were injured and killed, they were from these regions. And you know how you can tell if you're anybody who studies this region, you gotta look at their last names. Clear as day. and then when you didn't see their last names, you could just look at them. They're not indigenous Russian people, right? And so basically, I think that closed out, is like the way that you really deal with this is I think that there are just some people who have revealed themselves to have their own form of colonial or imperial bias. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that when we think about oppression, we don't see it in quote unquote white faces. I think that's another thing, and another topic, but I think that's a big part of it. But this position from some people on the left who sympathize with Russia over their approach in Ukraine, you have to completely ignore Russian atrocities and center Western imperialism, and ignoring everything else, like ignoring China with the Uyghur situation, right? That there's a whole bunch, so it's not the only imperialism that exists. And I think that this group of rabid people, I think that they're not going to be changed, no more than I think racists can be changed in many respects. That's how intense I think it is.
Do you want to follow up on that?
May I?
And then,
Yeah.
and then we'll turn to.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you landed exactly where I wanted to sort of make a turn and
Yeah.
ask you a question. And this has to do with your own experiences in Ukraine as a minoritized American.
Yeah.
Right, in a context in which the invading army is drawn from impoverished minoritized communities
Yeah.
in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of how I don't know how your interactions with other people in Ukraine in light of that fact have sort of how has your experience changed in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale war, with respect to sort of how you experience how other people see you amidst everything.
So here's the thing, and this is going to sound funny to you, but I'm just going to say it. Particularly since I've been so outspoken about Gaza, I think a lot of people when I covered the war, first people came to know me from my coverage. Then I think people forgot the fact that I'm Black. I think obviously you can't forget if you look at me, right? But what do I mean by that? I think that when I was helping to ferry, like, quote unquote, white children across the border, I think people saw a lot of themselves, in the work that I was doing. But, I think that these conversations that you're talking about starting when I directed my attention on how African students were treated, right? And let me be very clear, they experienced extreme racism from Ukrainian population. Like, that's just true. Now, be very clear, I think a lot of people criticize me because they say that I'm spreading Russian propaganda, which is quite ridiculous because everything is not Russian propaganda. You get what I'm saying? So it was very interesting how people were lining up behind me and supporting me and rallying me when I was talking about their cause, genocide, etc. But I had a lot of people turn on me, going back to the scrutiny part, when I started saying, hey, these Africans are being mistreated, and I've had a lot of difficult conversations with Ukrainians because I say at the end of the day, one of the reasons why, when I first went to Ukraine in 2009, I was denied housing like 10 different times, like my first day. I had money, everything. They're like, we don't rent to Black people. And those are some of the polite conversations. What ended up happening was that, when I got to Ukraine my first day, the real estate agent that I hired, and I was there on my Fulbright, right? they were saying, "Hey, Terrell," and he looked at me, shook my hand, rubbed my hand. He said, "Your skin color is causing us a lot of problems."
Mhm.
Hi, my name is Eva. Right, true story. And so I went through that. Now, I also had experiences with police. And what's interesting about being Black there is that, when you go through programs like the Fulbright, unfortunately, they're not, I was the first Black person to really complete that program as a student. The NBC gives you an orientation, the Fulbright people give you the orientation, but my real orientation came from the Africans who were there. And they told me very carefully, one, if you're there, be careful about walking around with Ukrainian white women. That's the first thing a lot of people told me. Number two, I was told about how to deal with police. That was the real information I needed to know. So I was stopped. I got stopped many times by police that I stopped counting at 30. It was far more. I just stopped counting. One guy stopped me, and officer stopped me. And it's kind of like when you're a Black person in your car and you're looking at the police and you're like, okay, I'm about to get pulled over. Similar thing, I was at the Vokzalna metro station. Young kid, looked like he's about 20, looked at me, come here. I pretended like I didn't know Russian. I spoke to him in English. Why am I here? He looked at me in Russian. He said, "You're a nigger, you're bringing justice to our country, so give him up right now." So long story, there's a whole thing to it, but long story short, he let me go. But my point is that, now I can honestly say like the police, they don't profile people anymore. Now I'm dealing with this as a Black American who can pull out my US passport. Could you imagine somebody who comes from the continent of Africa is treated? Now, I'm not saying that this is purely a Ukraine issue. I could walk out on the street right now in front of NYU, deal with the wrong cop, and get my head blown off. Get my point, y'all? It's not a Ukrainian issue, but anti-Blackness is a global problem. And I've had very difficult conversations with Ukrainians about this because at the end of the day, I'm a Black man who exists in this country. And so I am as much as I put my heart and my soul into my reporting, I am a person. And I experienced all these things. I've had, when I was covering the war, I had one of these nuthead territorial defense people pull a gun on me, walk me by gunpoint, multiple blocks, whole bunch of stuff. But yeah, I mean, race, it's really challenging. And the reason why it's challenging, I'm sorry to be so long, but it's important. The reason why it's really challenging is because I realize that even for senior level officials, I'm usually the first Black person that they've had a full conversation with. That's number one thing. I'm talking about at the highest levels. I've spoken with officials who've studied in New York, who've studied in DC. New York has the highest number of Black people per population in the United States at 2+ million people. Washington, DC has about 45–50% Black people. I spoke to people who go to these institutions, they never speak to anybody Black. And I've had to have conversations with them and say, yes, you are oppressed in your part of the world. When you come over here, you integrate into whiteness like everybody else. I've had those conversations and they're not easy. And so the work that I do goes well beyond my journalism. Because in order for me to exist comfortably and represent who I am fully, I have to really come out with my humanity as much as I do my journalism. And what makes my work a little bit easier is that my independence empowers me to be both.
Thank you so much.
I can take questions. I don't know about that, but I'm comfortable where I can do.
Yeah, why don't we turn to questions? You've been such a patient audience, and I'm sure that's a really interesting. It's a really important point, and you sort of touch on it in some of your episodes of the podcast, which I encourage you all to follow if you don't. That channel, podcast, all the different incarnations that it has. But these intersections of militarism, militaries, protecting citizens from violence. You know, you sort of, you do it across time and space really, really well. But let's turn to you, and then I'll open up the Zoom chat in case anyone's on there, and we'll.
So Azadeh and Terrell, if you guys could just move slightly.
Yeah, yes.
And you can stay.
can stay.
Thank you so much.
All right. I think right, yeah,
Yeah,
should we
you
start
guys-
within the
yeah.
room?
Sure, thank you so much. It was very interesting. My question is this: how do you deal with layers of oppression? Because, you know, taking some of the stuff that you said, you know, during the talk, but there are layers to a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you know, a lot of people in Ukraine, a lot of people in Russia, a lot of people in Eastern Europe in general are racist. A lot of people in America are racist.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there are a lot of people who, while being racist at the same time, are being oppressed. A lot of people, you know, are indigenous to one area, but not indigenous to another. A lot of people who are not indigenous to a certain area. So, you know, we talked about people in Siberia, a lot of Russians there, ethnic Russians who are not indigenous. Then you talked about Iraq, people there, well, probably not indigenous because they came there like after the 7th century. But on the other hand, you could consider them indigenous as well. Palestine, is it indigenous? Are the Jews indigenous there? Are the Palestinians indigenous there? How do you deal with that? And stuff like Israel and Hamas. On the one hand, Israel is doing a lot of bad stuff in the West Bank.
Gotcha.
On the other hand, Hamas, you know, oppressing people in.
How do I navigate all of that? Like, how do I?
Yeah, how do you
so-
deal with the layers there?
So here's the thing, I only deal with what I know. That's the first thing, right? Because here's, you know, to be perfectly candid with you, the Palestine part is a new section of my reporting portfolio. So I can honestly tell you, I'm an expert when it comes to Ukraine. Like I'm studying Ukrainian right now. I'm taking the Russian class, you know, the classes that I live there. So I can tell you authoritatively about Ukraine and about all these other things, right? As much as I can without being a native and, you know, et cetera, right? Like I can straight up tell you this very fluently. But also it's the way that I position my reporting. The way that I position my reporting, it comes from how do we all live in this world together? And as a viewer, right? Or as a reader of my work, I want you to be smarter. And so my work is centered around, okay, this conflict is happening. Why do you care? And what are the issues you need to know? So to break it down and answer your question, it's really about how do I make you a better person? Right. And so in the case of Ukraine, it was really easy. This is a genocide. My whole thing was to break it down. Okay, this is not quote unquote white on white crime as we see it here in the States. Yeah, I break it down that way. Whereas in Gaza, where you talk about you talk about Palestine, et cetera, you talk about the apartheid. I think that part is really easy. Now, what about the people who disagree? I think the way that I handle, let's say the Gaza example is, we can talk about, it's my responsibility as a journalist to push back against people who bring up anti-Semitism when they criticize the state, right? There are, you know, it would be, you know, but then another thing is when it comes to, and then with Ukrainians, when I've had some conversations talking about how some people are saying, why do people care about Ukraine and they cry, but don't say anything about Gaza? There's a constructive way to deal with this, right? So it's not pitting people against each other to talk about the ways in which the coverage is different. It is divisive when you pit the tragedies together, right? Because they're all screwed up and they shouldn't happen. The way that the way I talk to Ukrainians about this, and I've had these conversations a lot, is how do, you know, with Ukrainians, and I've had these conversations with people who are, you know, on the far left, how do we stand in solidarity with other oppressed peoples around the world, right? And the way I break it down is let's just say as a man, right? I did not create sexism. I am eligible to participate in sexism, whether I want to or not. If you are, let's say, a Ukrainian, Ukrainians did not create this Gaza conflict. Ukrainians did not create this hypocrisy in the way that the media has been covered. They did not create this. However, when it talks about standing in solidarity, as Ukrainians have asked the world to stand in solidarity with them, the question is, am I eligible to be passive or indifferent to this, whether I want to or not? And the answer is, yeah, you're eligible to. Now, the goal is, do we push back? How do we push back against it to say that I'm going to be in solidarity? I am privileged within this particular context, and I'm going to reject it. I ask everybody to reject whatever privilege they have in a certain position where that empowers them. And I think that in my journalism, that's how I can empower everybody to be on the same page. And of course, there are a whole bunch of layers. We talk about the layers, but that's the way that I try to navigate them, by finding a common ground where everyone can engage my journalism in a constructive way where they can be better people.
Let's take one more from in the room and then we'll go to the chat.
Thank you so much, Terrell. My question is, I'm not sure if it's appropriate to the context, but I'm so impressed and I'm curious. I would like to borrow that for myself or my future journey, my personal journey. I understand
It's
that.
not copyrighted, it's okay.
I know, but I just I might use it as an affinity. So I understand that going through a systemic oppression can be a sort of vaccine against bullshit in your life further, right? To give you some sort of integrity. But on the other hand, it's so stressful that a lot of people are falling into denial just because it's an easy coping mechanism for a psyche. And I'm looking at you, I'm just wondering, like, how did you manage to go through all that BS and keep maintaining integrity, even in the cases when you're when you're struggling, when you're an unknown, ground, and you face, racism that is pretty much denied in Eastern Europe, quite frankly, they're blind. How do you maintain this energy to keep up with this integrity?
It's a calling.
It's
So look, just to give you a background, I grew up, in the trap. And if y'all don't know what that means, slang means a house where drugs are sold. Okay, the trap, right? But if you would have told me as a kid that I would be in this room talking to you, I would be like, out of your mind. I think for what I do, you have to be called to do it, because in my life, in my personal relationships, I made everybody uncomfortable. I've had a whole bunch of challenging conversations where I've had no one like me. So an example of that is, and it happens, and I've lost a lot of friends on all sides. You'll be amazed at the number of conversations that I've had with people who are considered pro-Palestinian, to tell them, who denied the genocidal behavior that's going on in Ukraine. I tell them, you're wrong. I've had a number of tough conversations with Ukrainians on the opposite direction. You're wrong. I've lost people who I genuinely cared about on all sides of it. That's why I think that I'm going to die doing this work one way or the other, because spiritually, I feel it's the right thing to do. That's why I didn't leave Ukraine. I felt it was the right thing to do. I felt it was my moral duty. My godmother, after I called Bud, and he said no, essentially, she's, and I told you, my godmother is a person of faith. And she said to me, Christians don't do that. You can't do it. So it's a spiritual thing for me. And I also I attend a Black Liberation Theology Church in Brooklyn, Concord Church of Christ, right? And the first 2 to 3 pastors of that church were enslaved people, several of which had to leave their pastoral position because of the Fugitive Trade Act. The professor who taught my pastor, James Cone, is a theologian who taught Black liberation theology. Under my belief, it centers Black people in the liberation in God's kingdom, But in our church, that liberation of us means that if we can be free, then all of us can be free. So it's a spiritual thing for me. And so I just know the spiritual path that I'm on is going to replenish the drained feeling that I have with better friendship basis, because I'm here for another purpose. And to be quite frank with you, I don't know exactly what that is completely. I feel like it's something else. And I really want people to, I name it Black Diplomats. I want all of us to feel like we can participate in each other's liberation. And that means that we have to call out everybody. Going back to the initial questions about power. I don't care who it is. If the power is wrong, then we challenge the power and you replace it. Whether it's gender, whether it's LGBTQ rights, etc. My theological tradition compels me to continue to push through these challenging moments that you brought up. And it hurts me as a person, but I can't turn back on the calling. And that's what it is. I mean, I think the best thing, going back to, I keep saying Bud's name all the time, but I think the best thing that I did was I went to Russia. It was I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that moment of my godmother admonishing me. And so I have to stand in place of the Black people in my life who will never go to these places, because I'm informing them, and my work in Ukraine and elsewhere is empowering them here at home. That's just the way I see it, and it just strengthens my resolve to keep moving forward. So I'm sorry, it's not some intellectually endowed question about this professor or this school of thought. It's a totally faith-based approach that inspired me to move on.
I'm just gonna give you a smattering of questions in Manhattan. You can take what you choose. Some of them have touched on things we've talked about, others are sort of coming in at it again. There's one question about the person says, I hear you about Trump and white supremacy have increased anti-Semitism, but how should we think about and weigh the contributions to anti-Semitism from Black and Muslim communities? That's one question.
Yep.
There are two questions that are sort of probing at how Ukraine and Palestine can be viewed in the same paradigm. Maybe it would be better to have these questions in person, because there's a kind of line here that is
You might answer the first one.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because okay, so when you talk about the bigotry and anti-Semitism of Black people, so I don't think that's a complicated question. Look, as human beings, every human being could be discriminatory in some way or another against another person, right? So one of the things that I say about white supremacy, you don't have to be white to aid and abet white supremacy, right? So I'll give you a prime example. During the administration of Donald Trump, you had a Ben Carson. He grew up, born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, like myself, right? I think that Ben Carson, who became the head of HUD, is one of the biggest perpetrators of white supremacy that we have seen because of his overseeing of housing policy that's discriminated against people. So I think that I'm a believer that your race, your gender doesn't make you right. Right? So yeah, you can definitely do it. Now, what I would say is going back to that question more specifically, yes, Black people obviously can be anti-Semitic, right? I think the problem comes with the, again, the moral consistency and how we criticize people, right? So I'm actually writing an article about this, about the hypocrisy of condemning Hamas, right? So we obviously know that what they did was an act of terrorism. The problem is that we don't call out all forms of terrorism. So it's not a simplistic matter of saying that, well, what do we do with Black people and these other folks who are anti-Semitic? Yeah, you can be anti-Semitic. Your race has nothing to do with it. And you can be from an oppressed group and continue that oppression of others. Going back to the main point that you can have a history of the Holocaust and oppress Palestinians. So it's really a matter of being morally consistent about what we condemn. That's the issue, not who does it because they come from a particular group. So what's the other question?
There's a couple more. There's one that I thought was a cool question. We can go back to the Palestinians and, but I don't, there's other questions too. What were some of the things that were unexpected in the way in which people received you in Ukraine?
Let me see. I'll tell you some really great stories, right? So, here's the thing, like I'm a big cheerleader of Ukraine. In fact, this right here comes from Kosiv. This is a Ukrainian garment. Like I love Ukraine generally, right? Like I'm a big cheerleader of the country just overall. But just to tell you the importance of put this back. but here's the thing that was really great about Ukraine that as it came out. How I was received. So me and Andre were taking people across the border, right? Andre did all the driving. And there were times when we could not get housing or anything like that. You couldn't get on booking.com, Airbnb, everything was just shut down, right? I would use my Twitter and tweet out to people and say, hey, I'm going to be in this town in a few hours. Can somebody help us one way or the other? Somebody's cousin from Kentucky, somebody's sister from Alabama was like, you can stay at our place. And that's pretty much how how many of us got through, just with the kindness of people. And people just received me just as best as they could be. And so, for all the challenges I have of being Black, and so I can honestly tell you that there are just as many people, and even more people who embrace me and who were really thankful for what I was doing, and actually have been very open to me, even talking about the conversation about race. So I just find a lot of hope and optimism in a place. So I was just really intrigued by the power of social media and how Ukrainians kind of gathered around and just were willing to support anybody who was helping to help their country. But also, I am, even in my current reporting, close it out. I find that even in this tragic, in this invasion, regardless of how the struggles they're going through, people still trust me with their stories. I just find that there's just an incredible amount of trust in the general population there, which is one of the main reasons why I live there. I have no problem talking to pretty much anybody about anything. And I just think that's really a good testament to how I've been treated by most Ukrainians. And so I hope that answers the question, but that's the person that came to mind.
Anything else from in the room? Should we do a batch so that we've got a few questions at once? Because I think we're sort of coming to time, right, Sasha?
That's cool. I mean, I can
15 minutes.
Okay, why don't we take these three and I'll write them down and prompt you so that, yeah.
Oh, me. Oh, sorry, I didn't see other people. Yeah, thank you very much, Terrell, and the panelists. The question is very simple and not that simple. So I really like the personal approach to journalism, and as an academic, I find it very challenging to write like that. So I feel very happy for you. I was really touched with what you said about liberation. And speaking of this tradition of internalized oppression in the region, in Ukraine and post Russian Empire, post Soviet countries, like to liberate, what does it mean for you? Like, and what is free Ukraine?
Okay, should we take two more? Yeah.
She's been patient.
Yes, thank you so much for speaking with us today. So I'll make my question just very short and brief, but you talked a little bit about independent journalism, and what would you say are sort of the pros and cons of being an independent journalist? And do you think logistically that helped you report in Ukraine?
Okay, and then there was a third.
Yes.
Please.
Hi. So I'm Ukrainian American. My family came here shortly after the Civil War, and I've been really interested in race studies. And so I've actually started following you before the war in Ukraine broke out. When I went to college, my roommate was from Haiti, and I became really interested in Polish-Haitian relations and started studying. and learn from you and Julie St. Barnum at UPenn.
Oh, thank you. We're the two Black people that do.
Yeah. Here's my So I came down here, but I'll get to my question. So I wanted, when people ask me, or, you know, we talk about like the far left today and their defense of Russia. And one of the things I always bring up is what you talked about today was that there was a lot of Black Americans that moved to Russia. And basically kind of hide behind that, and that it's a raceless state, right? But from you and from Vernon, is, you know, what I've learned was that wasn't really true. And I think what I always try to kind of compare it to is how MLK described polite racism of the North. And I was wondering if that's a fair assessment, or if you have any like other suggestions on how to approach that.
Yeah, so let me take that question and come for top. So basically, you know, Peraza, there's a book, and I showed y'all on our Zoom earlier, a few days ago. I can't think of the name. I think it's called Russia's Identities. But basically, the Peraza, the word in Russian, Peraza, it was first of all, the Russians, it wasn't raceless because Russians actually, in the Russian Empire in particular, functionally used race in order to build their empire. That's just a fact, right? And so it started showing up in Russian literature around 1860, 1870, something like that. Again, matter of fact. And like I said, I showed them in the book where he talked about it. But basically, you can't, I've been to Central Asia where they have their entire history of Russian colonialism, and then it goes into the Soviet period, right? But I think that as far as with Black Americans going to Russia, that was a very small, the Soviet Union, that was a very small number of people. And I think that Black people I think that any group of people you'll find a population within them that will seek their own comfort wherever they feel that they can find it. Paul Robeson was the most famous person who tried to do that. Interestingly enough, Paul Robeson was a hard communist to the day he died. But what's interesting about him and the biography written about him was that he really started to challenge or think deeply about these things, or confronted with his own pro-Soviet views when a lot of his Jewish friends were killed during the pogroms, right? And essentially, and there's another book, and if you follow up with me, I promise, because I'm citing this from verifiable facts, is that allegedly he and Paul Robeson and Khrushchev were on a beach in Odessa, and Paul Robeson brought up his Jewish friends, and Khrushchev cussed them out to bring it up, and all of his music and everything was just taken off of the Soviet airwaves, right? So the reality of it is that there were a population of Black people who did find some type of security and comfort. What does that mean? Now, by American standards, that means you won't be lynched. Now, but as we learned during the 1930s, there are a number of Black people who were purged, which is also a fact, right? And so, what do you want to take? Do you want to take the not being hanged in Alabama, or if you get on the ear of the wrong official, you get purged? Right? So, and that's a whole complicated thing, and Kimberly can break that down a lot more than I could. But to close out that question, there's always going to be somebody to say, look at this and what about this, and which goes back to my earlier point of Russian hegemony is no better than Western hegemony or Chinese hegemony. I think it's really that simple. The other question.
The pros and cons of being an independent journalist.
So the
implications for logistics.
Let me tell you about the cons. The cons is you have to search for every dime that you get, and it's difficult. I mean, that's something I'm doing right now. One of the reasons why I'm in New York is I'm working on trying to find money to build a nonprofit newsroom, right? And so the second thing is, in addition to being a journalist, you also have to be an executive. And so I'm learning to build something from scratch. So during the invasion, I spent much of my time on network television. and I built a social media audience. Now, in hindsight, what I would have done was I would have built this YouTube channel that I'm building, you know, that I started right now. Would have done that sooner and would have put all my content and started doing work in that way. But it's inconsequential at this point. But it's also about bandwidth. Another challenge is that you really have to be clear. You have to be confident. You can't be afraid of criticism. Now I call it a challenge because most people are not built to personally take the criticism. A person that works at the Post, New York Times, etc., they can hide behind that wall. I can't. People direct their anger, their angst, whatever, directly at me. Most people can't handle that. Now, the advantage is that I don't have to worry about being fired from a job. Number two, I have the space to create my outlook and my style of journalism in ways I can't do in a newsroom. I don't think that the type of work that I do is compatible for most newsrooms, right? And then two, I think that my style of journalism, if I could think of any place where it could be someplace like Vice, which is I think it's gone through a bankruptcy right now, you know, those types of places. And so I enjoy the challenge of building on my own. It's funny because anytime I go to Ukraine, the common joke that I get from people when I worked when you were following me, you probably followed me when I was at The Root. Maybe it was a Black run publication. A colleague of mine, anytime I would go to Ukraine, she would say, because I go there so often, she would say, Terrell, tell your wife and children hello. Because they have a family, which I don't. And the point I'm bringing that up is that I don't. And since I'm single, we don't have anything right now, I mean, eventually I do. But the point of it is that I like the challenge of kind of really learning how to be an executive and building this awesome platform from scratch, because in the grand scheme of, and what I want to do is I want to be able to teach students the type of work that I do, right? I want to be able to be in a class, you know, be in rooms like this and have more time to flesh out my outlook, you know, point by point by point, because I feel like my work would be something that benefits everyone, because I'll also be teaching people who will never be journalists how to be better consumers of media, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the beautiful advantage I have of being independent, is that I can set out these ideological and these professional frameworks without any kind of pushback. It's all on me. And I love the challenge of learning how to go and ask for money, learning how to develop advertising, building an audience, because I can say I started from the scratch. It's really challenging. But I love that challenge. But thank you. What's the last question?
What does liberation mean
to
you?
So what does liberation mean to me? Liberation is one where a Ukrainian can exist and not have to worry about a drone attack. One where, for example, I went to Odessa, where Russian is commonly spoken there, right? And I say this as somebody who's a foreigner, and you know, I'm sensitive about the language dynamic. I don't think it's my place as a foreigner to tell people to referee the language conversation, but you know, when I'm out in the West, obviously, I'm learning Ukrainian, I'm developing it as fast as I can, but going to Odessa where people can say, well, you know, I'm Ukrainian, and they tell me we're comfortable speaking Russian because it belongs to the people and not the state. You know, people where they can also go and not have to worry about their country ever being colonized again, right? One where the world will rightfully respond to their pain and also respond equally to the pain of people who are in Palestine. Right, I think liberation, and I think liberation also includes us being accountable for our own type of imperialism that I think, frankly, is a poor model and really gives a lot of ammunition to countries like Russia and to countries like China. I think ultimately, I'm a believer that our foreign policy needs to have a liberating framework. Right now, and right now as a colonial, as an imperial framework, Rumsfeld talked about the liberating of Iraq, right? His twisted, perverted sense of liberation was colonization. And I think that the Ukrainian, the Jew, the person who lives in the Middle East, the Chinese person, the person in South America could all, I think that they all can share in a life where they don't have to worry about anybody's hegemony determining their fate, right? And I think that goes back to why I think my journalism is so important. And so I mean, I use the word hegemony, but my question is, how do you, into the central point of this talk, how do you want your world to be governed? And I want everyone to feel empowered that their voice is equally important as the official who is the Secretary of State, because at the end of the day, it's the people who empower these people, who empower our officials, right? And I want the Ukrainian to feel, to have solidarity with the Palestinian. I want the Palestinian to have the, to understand the suffering of people who are currently under occupation. I think that that reality is very possible. We just have to really look at ourselves and say, how am I privileged in these various contexts? Because we all have that particular privilege within our own particular context. Me as a Black man, I have privileges in certain contexts, thus the sexism point. And once we unpack our own positionality in these conflicts, then I think that leaves space for us to look at the other person with the same care and love as we want. I believe that world is very possible. We just have to will ourselves to it and not be afraid, right? Going back to your point of the relationships. I'm more afraid of a world in which partial freedom exists than I am in comfortably taking a side to accommodate another person's feelings that does not lead to the liberation of another person. I can't justifiably do that no more than I can walk down that street in Hebron and see that man suffering. I can't go through formerly occupied cities in Ukraine and deny their pain. And I'm happy I'm in this position, that I have the knowledge and the experience to go through these layers. Obviously not within 16 sound points like I am right now, but over time I have the bandwidth and I have the knowledge and the training and the experience to do so. And I want all of you all to be brave enough to take that journey with us, because if you're brave enough to take that journey with me, we do it together, then we'll be in a much better position to enjoy a world that's free of these atrocities that none of us want to see. I'm down.
If everyone has the energy, there's because there's 3 questions in the chat that all ask the same thing, so I feel that I should acknowledge them. They're all asking in different ways. How can you compare what's going on in Palestine with Ukraine? How can you compare Palestinians and Ukrainians? And each sort of has a sort of a little bit more, but I think that's the core of the 3, and I think you've covered it to an extent, but maybe if you could reiterate, because there's I think there's just a little thirst in the chat for more.
Fair enough. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't literally compare it. There are 2 different conflicts and there are 2 different paradigms.
Yes.
I think it's irresponsible to even try to compare them. So at least on social media, what I address is the way that the world responds to the two different conflicts. That's what I do. So I don't compare literally Ukraine and Palestine. I actually interrogate how our media and the coverage is different. I think that's fair game, right? And so, you know, what does that mean? And I think we talked about it earlier, you know, when I was in the throes of the first few weeks of the war, of the invasion of Ukraine, my whole thing was I saw people in pain and I wanted to help them. That's all I cared about. This year in March, when I was in the West Bank, I saw people in pain, and I wanted to figure out a way to help them. I am not blind to the fact that there are different racial dynamics that play a role in this, right? So afterwards, I realized that when I started talking about Palestine, there were a lot of people on the Ukrainian side that were saying that my outspokenness about what's going on there, they said I became unhinged, right? And so, you start going through people's comments and their reaction to you, and you start kind of figuring out why. And then it's just it was very aware to me that it was interesting because I wasn't unhinged when I was covering Ukraine. I'm the same person. And I think also people forgot that I'm Black and that Palestinians have had a long history with Black people in our solidarity, social justice movements. Goes back decades. And it's a lot more intense and it's a lot more interpersonal than Black people's relationship with Ukraine. So none of that has anything to do with down in Ukraine. It has more to do with the fact that you see this emotional reaction in Palestine from the people, right? And what I noticed with Ukraine, and I think a lot of the intrigue that people had with me was that I remember there was one trip where we were helping a mother with her twin daughters. And I think a lot of these white commentators saw their daughters and the people that I was helping. That's what I believe. Their tears, their crying, all this stuff. Those tears do not come down their cheeks when they see a dead Palestinian baby. That is not an issue for Ukraine. That is not that. So that's what I'm not comparing. I'm not saying that Ukrainians are responsible for that. I'm challenging the media reaction and how we respond to them. And I think that being responsible in journalism, we have to confront that. And so when I talk about all of us as people, when I draw Ukraine and Palestine together, and I speak a lot with a lot of my socialist friends in Ukraine in particular about this subject, is that, when Ukraine rightfully asked the world to support them, to really understand their history, to understand Russian colonialism and all these other things, I joined that because I participate in that. My whole academic background is geared to address that. I'm all for it. My challenge is, with a lot of Ukrainians, you all within the context of the media coverage, in many cases have gotten far more attention for what's going on in your country and a lot more empathy than people of color and their situation. There's a whole humanitarian crisis in Sudan right now that nobody's even talking about. Many countries on the continent of Africa, there are Black babies, there are people who are dying, and quite frankly, nobody gives a fuck. It is my responsibility to say, morally, what do we do with this? Remember when I said as a man, I did not create sexism? that I'm eligible to participate in it. As a man, it is my responsibility to push back against it, to be active in whatever way we can. I am not asking, challenging the media complex and also challenging media outlets. All I'm saying is, how do we get this same, how do we galvanize the same call to action that Ukrainians rightfully ask us to do to support their cause, get the attention that they have to bring attention to what's going on here. Again, there are a number of small groups of Ukrainians who are already working through these issues, and that's all I'm doing. And that has nothing to do with asking Ukrainians to be supernatural or anything like that. This is about morally. There's a saying that, well, Ukraine's going through a war, we don't have time for it. Well, you know what? There are people on the continent of Africa who are being asked to fight back against Russian propaganda, blah, 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 all these other things. And they're suffering too. How do we get this collective humanity together so that we can have an equitable stake in all of each other's lives? That is what I'm asking. And I don't think that's an unfair question, because all of us in our own context, whether it be men, women, our own nationality, have been confronted with this one way or the other. And I know for a lot of people, it's not a comfortable conversation, but you know what? It's not supposed to.
There's a lot more to say about the journalism, and you covered a lot of it, so I'm grateful to you for recentering us on that.
I like these questions. It depends on y'all, but I can.
Yeah, I think we should. I think for the sake of everyone at the center, we should wrap it up. But I mean, I think just as a sort of parting thought, because I sort of kicked us off with point of view. What is our point of view? Because in journalism, we always have a point of view, no matter what. And I think you left us with the thought that human security as a preoccupation is a point of view. Because human security in our world today, our security is deeply interconnected at the end. And thinking about civilians and the security of us in that way is a point of view. So I think that was a really rich conversation. So thanks to both of you.
Thank
really
you.
Extraordinary.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's an honor. And I'm happy that we can have this conversation in person as opposed to having these rapid back and forth on Twitter, which is.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you all.
So hopefully we can maybe next time you're back after another tour of the places you'll be reporting, we can do it again.
Yeah, let's do it, definitely.
Thank you to the Jordan Center for hosting.
Thank
us.
you, yeah.